Hello, my name is David Baxter and I'm going to be talking to you about unsolicited proposals and best practices that are identified internationally, as well as those relevant to Sri Lanka. We will go through the presentation and have an introduction. We'll talk about the context of unsolicited PPPs in Sri Lanka, following a review of some of the local PPP laws regarding unsolicited proposals, and then references to international best practices. As I said, my name is David Baxter. I'm an international PPP expert and thought leader with 24 years of experience. I'm also a collaborator with the World Bank's PPP unit, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the United Nations Commission for Europe's PPP Center of Excellence located in Geneva. I've also done a number of PPP blogs which have been contributed to the World Bank and which have been published on their website. Currently, I serve as a senior advisor to the International PPP Center of Resilience in New Orleans in the United States, and I'm a PPP consultant advisor to governments around the world. The government of Sri Lanka has indicated that it is interested in attracting foreign direct investment to Sri Lanka. Many ministries, especially the Ministry of Finance and Mass Media and the Megapolis Ministry, have launched an initiative to develop the infrastructure of Sri Lanka in partnership with the private sector. One of the methods that they are looking at using to solicitate collaboration with the private sector are public-private partnerships. In Sri Lanka, PPPs can be procured in two ways. The government, the public sector, will originate a competitive procurement on its own initiative in the first way, or as a second way, the private sector proposes an unsolicited innovative project to the government, hence the term an unsolicited project proposal or unsolicited proposal. It is important to note that at no time is the government ever forced to commit to an unsolicited proposal. If the private sector makes an offer or a proposal, it's up to the government to decide eventually whether it wants to accept that proposal, and it will follow a whole series of steps and procedures to ensure that the unsolicited proposal is given a fair review and that there is still an opportunity for competitive bidding. At no times is the unsolicited proposal meant to result in a sole source project automatically. When considering unsolicited proposals, it's important that governments feel comfortable with their choice. And to be comfortable with this choice, they need to ensure that the unsolicited proposal that's been presented to them is in line with the national strategic interests, that the project is viable, it is feasible, it's fiscally sound, and offers value for money. It's also important to take note that the project should be bankable. It is also important that the proposed private sector project is not a project that's being considered at the same time by the public sector. At all times, this should be a unique project. If the public sector is considering the project, then it should not be considered as an unsolicited proposal. It's also important that conflict of interest be managed so as to ensure that parties that are involved do not have conflicting interests or prior interests in the project, and this is one of the ways to ensure that corruption is not allowed. PPPs and unsolicited proposals are not new to Sri Lanka. They've been implemented since the 1990s when the first PPP legislation was introduced. There were successful projects, but there were also unsuccessful projects. And because of this, the government has initiated a strategy to create a PPP environment through the drafting of new laws and guidance that will create an enabling environment that is attractive both to the public and private sectors, especially concerning the idea of the allocation of risk to each of the parties. In addition, the government of Sri Lanka has collaborated with numerous organizations, including USAID, through the STAIR project to help build the institutional capacity of the government for public-private partnerships, as well as finding ways to help them develop guidance which can be adopted and adapted. The government has also committed to creating institutions that will implement the PPPs within Sri Lanka, as well as unsolicited proposals, and this will include the organization that has recently been formed, the National Agency for Public-Private Partnerships, which is located within the Ministry of Finance and Mass Media. So the question is often asked, what is an unsolicited proposal? This is a definition that needs clarity. An unsolicited proposal is an exception to the normal procurement process where the private sector introduces a project or a new idea. This is contrary to the normal procedure where the public sector typically initiates the project. Unsolicited proposals have advantages, but they should also be approached with caution. It is also interesting that when they are considered, that the government should identify and prioritize projects and ensure that this does meet their list of priorities. It's also important that they will generate innovation. The private sector can bring innovation, new ideas to the government, and this is one of the values of considering an unsolicited proposal, because often it introduces an idea that the government hadn't thought of previously. It's also helpful at times to consider unsolicited proposals because it helps the government to overcome early stage project assessments, because in this case the private sector will have done the upfront work and the government benefits if there is a good feasibility study and the upfront work has been done well. Unsolicited proposals also present challenges to governments that are considering them. Governments can find it hard to form a true assessment of the value of an unsolicited proposal if they do not have the technical capacity to prepare, procure, and implement PPPs. It also creates difficulty with fiscal planning. They also can inhibit competitive conditions. Many times people will consider an unsolicited proposal as a proposal that tries to bypass the competitive process, and this should not be allowed. And that also, another problem is that they can become distractions to prioritize projects. The World Bank and other international institutions have identified a number of problems associated with unsolicited proposals. Maybe a better word to use is challenges, because there are times that these challenges can be overcome. And they include the following. Unsolicited proposals do not always allow public agencies to overcome technical or financial constraints, so they don't deliver on what they offer or what they promise. They also might not expedite project implementation, so sometimes the process of implementing an unsolicited proposal can drag the process out. They require careful planning if they are to be considered, and many times the institutions don't have the resources. At times, they also might not introduce true innovation. There might be ideas that have already been tested. And so when the private sector approaches the government with an idea, it might not be truly innovative, and the government has to seriously contemplate if this is worth the effort. Taking all of this into consideration, it's important that the governments adopt a USP, or an unsolicited procurement strategy, that ensures clarity, that is predictable, that is transparent, and also is accountable to both the public and private sectors, because under this situation you want to protect both bodies. It is also important that any policies that highlight the unsolicited proposals be aligned with government priorities for development or for service provision. The government of Sri Lanka has entered into a process of creating a law or guidance that can be used for unsolicited proposals. You'll see the insert, which gives an indication of the Democratic Republic of Sri Lanka Supplement 30, which is focused specifically on the guidelines for the government tender process under reference 237, which deals with unsolicited proposals, and it introduces the idea of the Swiss challenge procedure. This law, or this act, was introduced in the year 2016. Although this act has been in position for a number of years, the government institutions have not always had the capacity to implement these guidelines. As a result, the government has undergone a strategy, or adopted a strategy, to work on adopting these processes, and has also created the National Agency for Public-Private Partnerships, which can be a source of help, advice, and guidance to line ministries which are considering PPPs. In the supplement, I would just want to stress that the supplement stresses that the Swiss challenge should be introduced. And what the Swiss challenge does is it takes a situation where an unsolicited proposal is received from a private sector party. It then goes through a process of evaluation, and then it takes us a step further by introducing competition by soliciting comments or counter proposals from other parties in the private sector. The national policy very, very clearly states that the unsolicited proposal method should be used by all ministries, government departments, public corporations, local authorities, and any businesses, whether they are privately owned or whether they are government institutions. It is important to note that no government institution is exempt from this. So the Swiss process, as well as the guidelines, is applicable to any organization within the government of Sri Lanka that is considering launching unsolicited proposal programs. The National USP project, or National Unsolicited Proposal Project, has a guideline or specific steps that are required, and they are shown here on the slide. They include project submissions, the justification and proposal screening, also approval of preliminary proposals, negotiations, bidder counter proposals and proposal evaluation, appeals and approval. We will look at each of these steps briefly so that you can have a clear understanding of what needs to be done should an unsolicited proposal be considered, and should you decide to move forward, how to implement the Swiss challenge process. During the proposal submission, the government requires that the original bidder, the private sector bidder, does provide a series of comprehensive information that is critically important for the success of the project. The more information that is available, the better the project will be understood, and the better it allows the government to make a decision on whether the unsolicited proposal is a viable project, whether it is desirable, and whether it will be carried forward. Gaps in information make the decision difficult, and if gaps exist, there might be the situation that the government would decline the proposal offer from the private sector. On this slide, you can see a number of requirements that include the justification of the project, specifically from the view of national interest. Every project that should be implemented with the national interest at heart. Also, they require feasibility studies that have a number of sections, which include market analysis, technical and financial analysis, also economic analysis, and many other forms. One of the more important and more recent analyses that is required is that of the environmental impacts. There are also pre-qualifications, so it's really important that the government understands that the private sector entity which is proposing the project is capable of carrying out the project. So pre-diligence or due diligence work is really important to ensure that the proposer can carry out the project, because if there's suspicion that the project cannot be carried out by them, it would not be in the interest of either party to proceed. The preliminary financial plan is also important, specifically in the case of public-private partnerships, because in this area, the public sector is expecting the private sector to make a commitment, a financial commitment. And it is really important that the financial commitment makes sense through a sound economic model and a sound financial modeling process to ensure that the project can move forward with success and it won't run out of money or be underfunded and fail. It's also important that project implementation plans be included in the proposal, and this is the time frame for the construction of the project, the implementation, the expected outcomes. It must be remembered that PPPs can be projects that can be as long as 25 years or even longer in duration. So in many projects, people typically focus on the design, build, finance, operate, and maintenance side. But under PPPs, it takes it a step further. It takes it to the operation and maintenance phase. And it's during this phase that the project needs to run so that it can generate the necessary revenues to ensure that the debt is paid off and so that the project will eventually be paid for. This is why it is so important to have a project implementation plan that is concise, detailed, and can be adjusted over time to compensate for variations in currency, taxes, etc. It's also important that the cost that's going to be incurred by the original bidder in developing the proposal be described. The government does not want to be trapped later on should the original bidder not be chosen with unrealistic demands for costs to develop the proposal. So the private sector needs to make a very clear indication of what it thinks it will cost for them to deliver the proposal should the government give the go-ahead. Justification is important. It's really important that the government be able to justify whether the project is going to be worthwhile, whether it's going to be beneficial to the country in terms of socioeconomic development, employment, generation, technological transfer, capacity development, and many other factors. It's also important that a project committee be put together that can evaluate the proposal and help make the decision regarding the unsolicited proposal. During the approval phase, it is important that very, very specific steps are followed that need to be outlined in the government's law. The law or the guidelines that we have been referring to do have very specific guidelines or steps that should be followed for the approval of the preliminary proposal. What do we mean by the preliminary proposal? By the preliminary proposal, we mean the proposal that the private sector has initiated under the form of an unsolicited proposal. Later on, when this proposal is tested, there will be counter proposals, but the evaluation is critically important. The designated authority will review the unsolicited proposal. If it feels comfortable that there's merit in moving forward, it can submit this with a detailed recommendation to the special committee functioning under the Cabinet Committee on Economic Management, the CCEM. And in this way, the project can be endorsed to move forward, or at this phase, it could also be declined, and then the bid is ended. During the negotiation period, the private sector and the public sector will undergo a series of negotiation processes to review the proposal. It's also important that during this time that the development cost, as I said, be developed and understood, and it's also be important that the committees that are involved should be involved and have a say. The line ministry is critically important in this role, as well, or the impacted line ministry, as well as the Ministry of Finance and its partners. So the negotiation project has the negotiation process has many moving parts that need to be carefully organized so that all parties understand very clearly what they are negotiating. Once negotiations have been completed and the decision has been made to move forward with the unsolicited proposal, you'll enter into the stage where procurement documents are prepared and other parties are invited to submit counter-proposals. It is important that during this process, the counter-proposals are gathered through an information process that which involves publicity that is distributed about this project nationally and internationally to ensure that a fair amount of competitors are going to consider bidding on the project. It's very important that the process is clearly understood when it's an unsolicited proposal, as many private sector partners or potential private sector partners who are going to compete against the original bidder really want to understand what the project is about and do not feel that they have a disadvantage. So the information that is shared needs to be very, very clearly articulated, needs to be prepared well so that all parties have a fair chance at competing on the project. This is where the competitive side comes in, but this is also where the transparency considerations need to be considered. What is also important that when the government asks for counter-proposals through a procurement process, usually through an RFP that could be initiated, there could also be an expression of interest process, it is important that the counter-proposal parties be given an opportunity to respond sufficiently. This depends on the technicality and the detail of the project, but the shorter the response time, the more there will be parties that will be unwilling to compete for the project because they feel they won't have enough time to analyze the proposed project. For the avoidance of doubt, the guidelines indicate there should be no less than 30 days which avoid Sundays and public holidays in Sri Lanka. This is important, but please take note that it's no less than 30 days. 30 days is not the ceiling, 30 days is the threshold. Once the process has then been initiated, you'll find the situation that the different parties will initiate their proposals. They will present it to the government. Most times these are companies that have been pre-selected or have been selected due to the competencies that they show. These parties then will have their projects compared against the original bidder's project, and the original bidder project is almost considered a threshold project. Two things can happen. In the first case, the original bidder's project might be good enough and sufficient enough that it's easy to make a decision. At other times, there's a situation could occur where one of the competitors introduces a project that is better. Better means it could be technically better, it could be financially better. And at this stage, the decision makers are faced with the challenge of deciding who they're going to move forward with. Typically in the Swiss challenge, the original bidder will be given an opportunity to make a counter offer. And under this counter offer, they will then present a new or a secondary bid, which will then take into consideration what the other bidders have proposed. Typically, this will only take place if the project is technically sound and financially sound. What will also happen at this stage is that you will have a situation where there will be counterbidding and a process backwards and forwards to decide which party is going to be issued with the award. Sometimes it can occur that the original bidder will fail to match. In this case, then the secondary bidder or the next in line will be the one that is considered to be selected. Other times, the original bidder will win, and so then the process will be made. But what is important is it's a transparent process, I will repeat. It's also a competitive process so that the government can be ensured that it's getting value for money, it's getting a bankable project, it's getting a viable project, it's getting an economically feasible project, and that it is getting a project that is in line with the national priorities and needs of the country. At times, when the original bidder loses, it still is faced with a situation that it had developed development costs. These development costs, as we said earlier on, are often then given back to the original bidder if it loses as part of the unsolicited proposal. In this case, the decision can be made who will pay the original bidder that has lost. Typically, it will be the bidder who won, so the secondary bidder if it's not the original bidder. And at this stage, you will have the situation then that the winner will then compensate the original bidder with part or whole of the cost, depending on what the agreement was that was indicated in the procurement documents. What is important is not to keep the different parties waiting to find out what happened. It's always important, and the parties are always interested and anxious to find out whether they won or not. And the guidelines state specifically that it's important that within 1 week the parties have been informed who lost and who won. Obviously, things don't always go very smoothly, and there are times where appeals can be launched, where the different parties or where the loser might appeal. And this will require a very, very specific process that is outlined, which will decide what path can be followed and whether there is merit in the appeal. If there is no appeal, or if the winner is very clear and all parties agree, then there will be approval of the project. And in this case, it could be the original bidder or a new bidder. But whoever wins and is approved, this information then will be submitted to a cabinet member to the government through a cabinet memorandum, which then decides how the agreements are going to be negotiated, the final agreement, and it solidifies who the winner is, who the winning bid is. Internationally, there are a number of best practices that should also be considered. At this time, the government is undergoing a process of visiting international best practices so that it can sharpen and improve its process. One of the things that it is considering that any project that is submitted should not cost the government any money. The government feels very strongly that if an unsolicited proposal is going to be submitted, that the proposer needs to have a very clear understanding and a good argument is being made to ensure that this project won't cost the government money which it didn't intend to or doesn't want to spend. It's also important, as I said earlier on, that none of the projects that are proposed resemble or are examples or copies of projects that the government is considering already, because if this is the case, there is no innovation and there's no advantage. It's important that the government's also considering that no project should be considered for monopolistic services. This is airports and ports where there is no way of competition. It's also important that all the proposals be directed and submitted to the line ministries for review. This includes the technical and the financial feasibility studies. The line ministry can, under the new proposals that are being considered, reach out to the new National Agency for Public-Private Partnerships for support. This is a supporting organization, not an originator or initiator of public-private partnerships or unsolicited proposals. Cabinet papers will need to be produced as well. This is a requirement that indicate the value for money. All bidding documents will also require a review by the Attorney General's office to ensure that they are compliant with the laws of Sri Lanka and are compliant with the guidelines which are being established, as well as any future laws. Also, it's important, and they reiterate in the new guidelines, that if the original bidder is not selected, that they will receive compensation, and under this term, reasonable compensation. It's important to note, and I'll stress this again, that under no circumstances should the original bidder pressurize the government to make a selection. The government is under no obligation to consider the unsolicited proposal from the process when it is initiated through to the decision unless the project is viable, feasible, bankable, offers value for money, is in line with national priorities, and most importantly, is secured through a competitive bid. For tracking of projects, the government is also going to require that all documentation be very, very clearly gathered so that if there is an opportunity for anyone to protest, that the process is clearly explained and all parties can feel comfortable that a fair decision was made. Some closing comments. Institutions such as the World Bank recommend that unsolicited proposals only be considered as projects as a project of last resort. This is not because the World Bank is technically against PPPs or unsolicited proposals. It's just that they understand that there can be challenges in implementing unsolicited proposals and considering them. Governments should also be cautious about the process because a number of things that can happen, mainly in the first place that the government was not expecting to get an unsolicited proposal, and it can drive or redirect critical resources that are needed elsewhere. The other is also the financial constraints of budgets. It's also important to note that at times unsolicited proposals could be proposed at times that the government is not ready or is unable to provide the budgetary support that might be needed. Governments at times also lack the financial and technical expertise to review unsolicited proposals, especially those that are extremely innovative and those which are introducing new ideas that the government hasn't contemplated or untried technology or new ideas. It is important that at this stage, the government consider bringing in experts that can help them. One of the areas that is of critical importance also is the determination of the protection of proprietary information that might be offered by the private sector by the private sector, I mean the original bidder. It's important that they be given assurances that their information will be protected as far as it is possible under any public laws that determine information being shared if it's requested. It's important that the rules also be stated very clearly about proprietary information so that no parties feel that they were blindsided and were forced to give up information which is important to them. USPs, or unsolicited proposals, can be developed by public agencies and they can be competitively tendered. But there's also an indication that many of the large banks have found that essentially that in many instances unsolicited proposals perform no better or no worse than the typically publicly procured projects. So governments have to really be careful and understand why they are considering the unsolicited proposal and why they are entering into it. This ends the presentation. There is a wealth of information available on unsolicited proposals with many institutions. Two that I've listed here is the World Bank's policy guidelines for managing unsolicited proposals, as well as the most recent public-private partnership guidelines version 3. But if you go to the Asian Development Bank site or many of the other institutions, you can find valuable sources that will help you supplement your information, understand the process, and there is a wealth of information and detailed information on how to implement the Swiss challenge. I thank you for your time and good luck should you consider unsolicited proposals. Thank you.